All right, what is up, Nosebleeders? Welcome to the very first installment of From the Nosebleeds MMA podcast. I am Blake O'Rulian, alongside my co-host, Brick Harris, here to give you all things MMA every week on SoundCloud, YouTube, and IG Live. Brick, how are you doing today?
Man, I'm doing good. We're here. We're finally installed. We're in the booth. We're ready to go. It's a good time. We've put a lot of time into this. We've put a lot of meetings into this. So, this means a lot. We're excited. We're ready to go. Again, a big shout out to Don't Be Richard Music. He's the one who hooked us up with the awesome intro and outro that you'll hear again later. So, yeah, we really appreciate that. We're excited to get going. Yeah, today we're going to be talking about post-Lawler and Covington. Later on in the show, we're going to be giving personal introductions, talk a little bit about the show, give some fight analysis, talk about what is going on in the UFC and in the fight world in general. We're going to be talking about predictions for the next upcoming fights in these next few weeks, and we're excited. We're getting ready to go.
This is going to be good. This is going to be great. So as Brick said, with this being our first episode, we want to take a few minutes just to introduce ourselves, who we are, why we are here, and why we're doing this, and how we got here. So, Brick, do you want to take over for a second and introduce yourself?
Yeah. So Brick is short for Brigham in some cultures, not necessarily at all. It's more of a nickname, but Brick Harris. I'm from North Ogden, Utah, just about an hour and a half north of Provo, where we are hosting this beautiful podcast. I have a pretty decent background in fighting and in broadcasting, which is just perfect mixture for having a fighting podcast. I grew up family nights. We would watch WEC with my dad doing the play-by-play, and it was just a blessing to be able to watch, guys beat the crap out of each other for family night. So it was a good time. After coming to college, I dabbled a little bit in boxing and wrestling. I've always loved jiu-jitsu. I've always had favorite fighters more than I've had favorite NFL players. So it's a passion that I've had for a long time, and it's a blessing to be able to be alongside with you and doing this.
Brick is awesome. I'm so excited to be doing this with you as well. And I am Blake O'Rulian. Number one thing I want to get out of the way is I am a jiu-jitsu player. I love jiu-jitsu. I am a ground grappler, and that is my favorite thing to do in the entire world. I am also here studying on the campus of BYU, where we are recording this first podcast. And I am a news media student, hoping to become a reporter, a sports reporter to be specific, and would love to dabble in a little bit of MMA in the future as well. Hopefully have some people watch me on the TV as they have family nights of people beating the crap out of each other. So that'll be a lot of fun.
Not to mention he looks like Dominic Cruz. You can't see us, but he looks a little bit like Dominic Cruz, who is now a decorated fighter and broadcaster.
Absolutely. Dominic Cruz, one of the greatest bantamweights of all time. Possibly the greatest bantamweight fighter of all time until Henry Cejudo comes and takes that away. So let's get going. Let's get going into this. So of the fights this week, Brick, what were some of the highlights? What were some of the people, and what were some of the fights that really stuck out to you?
Yeah, so fights for this past weekend were nothing short of, entertaining. You had Jim Miller versus Clay Guida. Not to mention the main event, which was Colby Covington and Robbie Lawler. That fight, it blows me away that wasn't, UFC 241. I'm blown away that it was technically for an interim belt, but Colby Covington's going to take that belt to his grave, whether he loses or wins against Usman. So, yeah, that was a great fight. We're going to talk a little bit about that. We're also going to talk a little bit about Tyron Woodley. We're going to talk just a little bit about Clay Guida and his bout, and we're going to be giving some more insight to fights later on this week.
All right, so first I wanted to start it off with Clay Guida and Jim Miller. I was really excited for that fight. Two veterans, two Hall of Famer, one Hall of Famer with his fight against Diego Sanchez and Clay Guida, and then also Jim Miller, now the number 5 or the 5th most submissions in UFC history, getting his 9th UFC submission with that guillotine choke in the first minute of that fight against Clay Guida, which I thought was really interesting. Anyways, despite the fact that I thought it was so interesting that despite the fact that they're both so old, they both looked good. They both looked excited to be there. Clay got that first early hit on the chin of Jim Miller, and then Jim Miller looked kind of shaken up, but he immediately dropped back with a hit on the chin as himself. Clay looked shook, dropped his head, and you never want to drop your head against Jim Miller. He dropped him straight into that guillotine, and that was it for that. Guida now, 54 pro fights, 37 years old. You're in the Hall of Fame. My question is it time for Guida to retire? I would say yes. What do you think, Brick?
It's a good question. It's interesting because fighting is unlike any other sport. You know, you could make the argument that Brett Favre should have retired a long time ago. You know, it's football; he's taken a lot of hits, but this is absurd to have someone who's how old's Clay Guida? 35?
37.
37. Okay, you got someone who's 37 years old who's been literally fighting as a job for a couple of decades now. I mean, I would be crazy if I were him to not hang up the gloves at this point.
What's insane though is it looks like he just loves being there. He's so excited when he did his octagon walkout. That was like the longest walkout I've ever seen because he had to high five and hug and take pictures with every single person when he was walking out. And by the time he finally got there, I was like, oh my gosh, like he's still like just so excited to be there after all these years. It's really incredible. I'm sure that feeling walking up to the octagon is unlike any other. I thought Guida looked great against BJ Penn. Granted, everybody looks great against BJ Penn these days.
Right. Blake's just full of shots today. He's just taking shots at everybody.
But Clay Guida is a legend, and I think there's always a safe time when it's time to hang up the shoes. And I think after how quickly he was able to get submitted by, and how quickly that one shot to the chin dropped his head, might be time to hang up the shoes for Clay Guida. Absolute legend, and that should be it for him. So,
yeah, it's a really good point to make. It's a good discussion. But as we move on, we're going to move on to the main event of the evening, which was Robbie Lawler, Colby Covington. And we were just talking about this show just before we came in here into the booth and we started producing and hosting that this is possibly one of the most groundbreaking fights in the welterweight division. Now, that may sound pretty outlandish because it was a fight that went to the decision. Granted, there were some good moments, some bad moments in the fight for both fighters, but since the end of this fight and what this fight means for both fighters and for the division in general, I can't think of a better welterweight bout that has caused this much shift in the media, caused this much excitement in the media.
And a divide too, right? It seems like, and I agree. I'm on the majority side of this. With you have Colby Covington almost versus the world, where nobody wants to see him do well, nobody wants to see him win, but he comes back after that long layoff where he hasn't been fighting, comes and takes on Robbie Lawler, who's been very active, and smokes him. You know, former UFC champion, former welterweight champion, absolutely smokes him. It was one of the greatest performances I think I've ever seen in terms of his ability to just manage everything that was going on. Coming into this fight, it was, can Colby, take the shots of Robbie Lawler? Colby didn't just take the shots of Robbie Lawler. Robbie Lawler wasn't able to get off any shots. 600 strikes thrown, 10 takedowns, 10 of 18 takedowns for Colby Covington. That was unbelievable.
They say, sorry to cut you off, they say offense is the best defense. And I think, especially in this fight, but just in Colby Covington's game in general, that statement is true.
Yeah. And my question I have two things that I took away from this fight. Well, actually three. Okay. Just thinking on the spot here. Number one, Colby Covington is a problem. Colby Covington is next level in terms of whoever he fights, he's got a chance against because he can control the fight at any point. Number two, it goes to show where Robbie Lawler is at. This is his third straight loss. Typically in the UFC, that's when Dana starts, giving the nod of, should we maybe release this guy? 4 of his last 5 he's lost. And it's starting to look more difficult for Robbie to get into that octagon, which really makes me sad because he's such a legend. And it's always hard to see these fighters that you love so much get absolutely starched. I mean, granted, he never was submitted, he never was knocked out, but it was a difficult fight to watch in terms of being a Robbie Lawler fan, I would say.
But I mean, you talk about Clay Guida a little bit and how he's a 37-year-old legend. Yeah. Robbie Lawler's 37 years old too.
Right.
He seemed better than Clay Guida, but at the same time, he raises the same kind of questions, Right. How much longer is he going to last? Although he's an absolute legend, he's got 14 losses under his belt. That's a lot of losses. Granted, he's gone the distance in most of them, which actually could be a detriment to his health and to his long standing in the UFC. But Robbie Lawler will, I think, forever go down as a legend of a fighter.
Absolutely.
Not only in the octagon, but outside.
Absolutely.
We talk a little bit about things that Colby Covington does to make himself a problem, just to give himself the haters that everyone loves to point out that he has. Colby Covington made some very interesting post-fight comments. Yep. We're going to listen to those here in a second. So this is Colby Covington's interview right after his win over Robbie Lawler this past weekend in Newark.
Hey, let's talk about the lesson we learned tonight. It's a strong lesson that Robbie should have learned from his good buddy, Matt Hughes. You stay off the tracks when the train's coming through, Junior. Don't matter if it's a Trump train or the Colby train. Get out the way!
All right. So just absolutely outlandish comments from the recently victorious Colby Covington.
Disgusting. Terrible. Granted, Matt Hughes went to Twitter.
Matt Hughes did go to Twitter.
He went to Twitter and he was like, look, I get it, whatever. Have fun poking fun at me. But I'm more of the side of Tyron Woodley, who also went to Twitter and said that, you shouldn't be saying those things. I was talking to one of my good friends.
Tyron Woodley, who's a teammate of Colby Covington.
Used to be. Used to be a teammate of Colby Covington. But I wonder why. I was talking to a good friend of mine, and I just said, dude, I just cannot. I was letting him know what was going on. He wasn't watching the fight. And I said, I just can't stand this guy. And he goes, well, that's just Colby. That's just who he is. I don't care who you are. You don't make light of someone getting hit by a train, and you don't bring all those things into the.
I mean, there's a line between sportsmanship and being a UFC fighter. Exactly. You know what I mean? Exactly. We can talk for hours about the difference between Colby Covington and the notorious Conor McGregor, who, when you think about it, very similar personalities, but the way that they are outlandish is very, very different. Conor McGregor made pretty awful comments leading up to the fight with Khabib, sure, with Jose Aldo, with Floyd Mayweather. Conor does not mince words. It's not like he's going to make sure he doesn't hurt anyone's feelings, but he does it in a different way. He's able to back up his talk, and it's more trash talk than talking like trash. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
make sense?
Absolutely. I think that's a really, really good point, and I completely agree with it. I think that Conor has such a way of, and obviously, I mean, right there with Chael Sonnen, the greatest talker in the history of the sport. Just so fun to listen to, so fun to talk about. The things that Colby is saying are distasteful. The things that Colby Covington are saying, he's not getting any fans, and I know he doesn't care about that. But it's hard to put somebody at the top of the totem pole when it's so hard to root for him. You know what I mean?
He's the bad guy.
He is.
It's a perfect. I don't know if I'd say perfect comparison. Well, yeah, we could say that because it's a perfect comparison of Robbie Lawler versus Colby Covington that we saw, 6-7 years ago with Anderson Silva and Chael Sonnen, right? Anderson Silva, Chael Sonnen had nothing but bad things to say about each other. And Anderson Silva is a saint in the sport. He's a saint. He's one of the best guys that the UFC has ever known. He's humble. He's just a good guy. You can't say too many bad things about him. And then Chael Sonnen goes to press conferences and calls him out for his ethnic background, calls him out for
speaking English.
Right.
Anderson Silva, you absolutely suck.
There it is.
Pound for pound best fighter in the world.
And he literally just says he sucks. Chael Sonnen is what I think is the pre-incarnated version of Colby Covington, if that makes any sense. Chael Sonnen was the bad guy. And although he lost both those bouts to Anderson Silva, everyone was rooting for Anderson Silva because he's the good guy. And I kind of think it was the same thing when Robbie Lawler lost to Colby Covington, because if you also saw on Twitter, John Jones made a comment about Robbie Lawler letting the world down.
Talk about two bad guys.
Oh.
It's the greater of two worses, So no, it's. Colby Covington is probably the least loved fighter in the UFC right now. I think that's safe to say. The third thing that I took away from this Robbie Lawler and Colby Covington fight was how good Ben Askren is, or how good he isn't. Right?
Explain.
So this was my big thing. This was my biggest takeaway. Robbie Lawler and Ben Askren, the famous fight, UFC 235, March 2nd. Robbie Lawler goes in there. Ben shoots. Robbie picks him up off the ground, slams him down, traps his arm, smashes his face in. Herb Dean easily could have stopped that fight right there, and that fight would have been under a minute.
Very true.
Askren gets up, fights his way, gets the controversial submission win over Robbie Lawler. Everybody fought it. But what did everybody say after that fight? Everybody said Robbie Lawler is still the guy. Robbie Lawler can still compete for a championship. Robbie Lawler is still the top of the totem pole. He faced the top of the totem pole. And he got demolished. Demolished by Colby Covington. I don't know if it's even demolished or destroyed is the best word, but maybe controlled. He was controlled that entire fight because anytime Robbie started to get something going, Colby would take him to the ground, hold him up against the cage, and gas him. Get him back up, and then by the time the 5th round came around and Robbie was like, well, it's just the puncher's chance now. Points are all against me. I have to knock this guy out. He couldn't do it because he was so gassed. That's the beauty of how good Colby Covington is. And that's why I think this was such a telling fight for the welterweights, where people are at, how good they actually are. So
it's a game of cards at this point, honestly, because you have 4 or 5 guys in contention for the belt who you could all say are right there, or at least are always in the conversation. Although Ben Askren got completely humiliated by George Masvidal. Yes. Although Tyron Woodley lost to Kamaru Usman. Although Robbie Lawler was destroyed by the interim champ and the people's champ, as he's conventionally called himself, Colby Covington, this is really a fight of 5 fighters at the top of the division.
So I completely agree. I don't think the welterweight division has ever been this stacked, this exciting. And this all started just this year. This is when the welterweight division had this almost unofficial tournament begin. So let me just take you through the dates of
Take me through the saga
of these things. So here's the saga of the welterweight division. The unofficial tournament began March 2nd, 2019 at UFC 235. Ben Askren faces Robbie Lawler, gets a controversial win over Robbie Lawler, moving him up in the welterweight standings. That same night, Tyron Woodley loses for the first time since winning the belt against Robbie Lawler in 2016. Usman takes over the belt, takes over the top of the championship. Right after that fight, Usman releases that he's been injured. He needs to go have surgery. And now the welterweight division is up for grabs as to who gets to fight Usman when he comes back. Yeah. The following week, UFC Fight Night, Jorge Masvidal knocks out Darren Till, smashes him, laid out on the canvas. That same night, Leon Edwards, also in London, gets his 7th straight win on the same card. And then in the back, we have the whole Jorge Masvidal, Leon Edwards fight where he gave him the 3-piece in the soda.
Right.
Following week, Anthony Pettis knocks out Stephen Thompson. Stephen Thompson, one of the top welterweights in the division, goes to the bottom. So now, who do we have? We have Askren losing to Jorge. We have Askren losing to Jorge Masvidal. We have Leon Edwards getting another win for his 8th straight, and then we have Colby starching Robbie. So now we have Usman at the top. We have Colby Covington as the top candidate.
Sure, number 1 contender.
Number 1 contender. We have Jorge Masvidal, and we have Leon Edwards. But I want to throw someone else in there that I think. And I don't know where this leaves Leon Edwards, as Ariel Helwani would say, the Tim Duncan of MMA right now. Jorge Masvidal, Conor McGregor. That is the fight I want. I want Usman, Colby, Jorge, Conor McGregor.
True.
And then it's just a matter of where Leon Edwards sits upon all of this. But this is where the welterweights are right now. It's Usman, Colby, Jorge, and Leon Edwards.
So we're talking about the welterweight division, and for good reason. We've said multiple times on the show, we think that the welterweight division right now is more exciting than it maybe ever has been. You just explained, in a nutshell, the top 5 or 6 fighters in the welterweight division, and that's why it makes it so interesting. We also talked a little bit about Ben Askren and his loss and how much that told us about him. Well, Ben Askren, after the Colby Covington-Robbie Lawler fight, he also went to Twitter and talked about how he's so sorry that he lost to Robbie Lawler because now we have to listen to Colby Covington and Kamaru Usman talk trash. Which, trash talk in the UFC is not often cringeworthy. A lot of times it's vulgar. A lot of times it's taken too far, as Colby Covington showed us just this last weekend and as Chael Sonnen has showed us in the past. but I feel like it's very rarely cringe, which
Shouts out Henry Cejudo.
shouts to Henry Cejudo. I mean, just his interviews in general are cringeworthy. But to have Usman and Covington on the same set, separated by Karen Bryant and Rashad Evans, and both of them are just sitting there like pale as can be.
It's gonna. I side with Ben Askren on this. It's going to be very difficult to hear these two talk. The Colby Covington Kamaru Usman post fight show was one of the hardest things for me to watch. I really just don't. How about this? Let's just keep the mics away from them. Let's not really build up this fight. Get a really good co-main. Let's just get let's put Conor and Jorge on that. Let's just put Conor and Jorge on that so that the two of them can just talk. Something to just put all the limelight away from Colby and Usman, because we don't want to hear that. We don't want to talk about that. We don't want to listen to that.
We've just been throttled with memes and with tweets of just the lowest quality and caliber. You'd think that guys who fight for a living would know how to fight virtually for a living.
Well, I would suggest that they get people to take over their social media accounts. Just something. If you really want to talk this fight up, just hand the phone over to.
You'd think that President Trump would say to his number one fan, Colby Covington, to follow his suite and hire someone to do that, right? All right, so now we're going to get into our, well, I guess it's technically only our second or third segment of the day, but it's also our last, sadly. This is something we are going to call championship rounds. Now, the way that championship rounds work, obviously in a normal fight, normal bout, you have 3 rounds, and then championship fights for belts, you have rounds 4 and 5, right? Rounds 4 and 5 are crucial. So what we're going to do is we're going to each come up with round 1, 2, and 3 picks or opinions or hot takes, and then 4 and 5, we are just going to make the most outlandish claims that we can, and if they come true, then, hey, you know what, ESPN, give us a contract because we're seeing things that you're not. So for round 1, I'm going to go ahead and make a pick. Chris Cyborg recently was released from the UFC, and Dana White made a pretty black and white statement that we are out of the Cyborg business. My first pick, and some of you might argue that this is quite crazy and, this isn't going to happen, so why are you using it now? I think Chris Cyborg will fight in the UFC again.
I would have to disagree. I think it's over. I think Bellator is going to hand Cyborg all of their money, every last dime. And
about $38.
Wow. Shouts out Hoist Gracie. And we are never going to see Cyborg in the UFC again. I don't think Dana wants to even entertain the thought of losing Nunes as the featherweight champion. I don't think there's a chance Cyborg comes back to the UFC.
I think the only chance resides in the fact that it would be one of the smarter marketing decisions that Dana White could do is after 5 or 6 years, if both Nunes and Cyborg are because Cyborg's going to go to Bellator or one championship and destroy.
Win the belt and continue her reign of being absolutely unstoppable next to Nunes being her only kryptonite.
And so the best marketing job that the UFC and Dana White could do is after both Nunes and Cyborg have 3 or 4, maybe 5 years of just dominance, Cyborg comes back for one of the best rematches in UFC women's history.
I think this is going to be a really interesting night, and this is one of the main reasons why. The last time Valentina Shevchenko has lost to someone whose name is not Amanda Nunes was September 3rd, 2010, to Liz Carmouche. Doctor stoppage at 135 pounds. Liz goes the distance with everyone, and it's been 6 years since she's won a fight that did not actually end up going the distance. I personally see Valentina Shevchenko and Liz having an absolute war. I don't think it's going to be one of the greatest head kicks of all time to knock out Jessica Ai like it was just a few weeks ago. I see Valentina coming out victorious, and I see Liz Carmouche staying where she is as a great fighter, but not anybody that can take down Valentina Shevchenko. I don't think anybody in the world can take down Shevchenko except
Blake Aurelian.
Amanda Nunes.
All right, there it is.
I'm no Amanda Nunes. Go to the floor and I'll get smashed.
I would give you the nod on that one. I do agree. I think Shevchenko, I think the Bullet is going to take this fight. I think she's going to come away with it. However, I don't think it's going to be that close. Although Shevchenko lost to Liz Carmouche, almost a decade ago, they're such different fighters. They are such different fighters. I think Carmouche has had a lot of fights go not her way, and that has been to the expense of a lot of cardio and possibly a lot of, physique.
Right.
All right, round 3, Cormier versus Miocic 2, the rematch. Cormier-Miocic last summer was one of the more interesting fights, and Daniel Cormier still astounds me as a fighter. I think he's one of the most interesting fighters in the UFC. I'm not a big fan of him as an entertainer, as a reporter, as a UFC personality, but as a fighter, he's an absolute monster. His wrestling alone is incredible, but the thing that I have just blown my mind over is the fact that Cormier wins a majority of his fights with striking.
Yeah.
He's got half the reach that John Jones and Alexander Gustafsson and Stipe Miocic have, but he bounced Stipe's head literally off the canvas. That is an expression that Conor McGregor uses, but this time it was totally literal. So my pick here, I think Cormier defends his belt. I really do. The things that the research that I've done, the fights of Cormier that I've looked at, and just the way that he picked Miocic apart like no one ever has, I don't see Cormier losing this one. I mean, I think it could be close, but I got Cormier in this one.
Here's the only reason I disagree with you. I think I completely agree with you. Daniel Cormier, one of the greatest UFC fighters of all time. I have him as number 7 as the greatest of all time. Number 7 on my list. Stipe is one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. Daniel Cormier has fought light heavyweight at 205 for the majority of his career. Get that all out of the way. If you go back and watch that fight, Stipe Miocic was giving Daniel Cormier the business the entire fight up until he got knocked. And he got his head dribbled off the canvas.
We bounce heads off the canvas in the UFC.
I think if Daniel Cormier can get him to the ground, because Stipe Miocic literally does not have a win, a submission win in his entire career, I think Cormier, if he can absolutely just smother him on the ground, I think that he has a chance. I don't think there is ever a chance that Stipe will get knocked out by Daniel Cormier again. If anything, I think Stipe catches him early, knocks him out cold.
When you look at the stats of that fight, and I've got them pulled up here, Daniel Cormier won on significant strikes, percentage, and efficiency. Total strikes, Stipe Miocic definitely had him, but overall landed strikes, Daniel Cormier had him. That's why I think, the fight was just so interesting because the number of takedown defenses, the number of takedown attempts was so low and the striking was so high that it's really hard to tell what kind of fight that was and which kind of fight it's going to be, if you know what I mean. I don't do a good Bruce Buffer. I don't.
Not many people do. It's okay.
But it is time. We are in championship rounds. This is round 4 and 5 of our 5-round picks, our hot takes. Blake, it is to your honor. Pick number 4, round 4. Go ahead.
All right. Well, if we are picking hot takes, if we are taking, the craziest things that could happen and we believe could happen, I'll make a more ridiculous statement. I'll say Khabib doesn't make weight, Conor fights. That's what I'll say.
Wow.
I believe that Khabib Nurmagomedov will not make weight at 155 for the lightweight championship against Dustin Poirier to unify that belt.
Bold.
I believe that once that happens, once he does not make weight, they will ship out Conor McGregor. No. Conor McGregor will fight in Abu Dhabi with everybody just spewing and spitting all these terrible things in the Russian language. And it is going to be an absolute insane event.
I've got a couple of hot takes that are probably more plausible than that.
I think if that's the case, I think the first person they call up is Conor McGregor.
To your credit, I think it's a possibility that Khabib does not make this fight. He has had problems making fights for weight, but also for injuries.
Right.
You never know. However, yeah, I don't know. I just think Khabib is on a roll. He's just been absolutely dominant since he arrived in the UFC. He's been pretty careful. He's been really smart about fights that he's picked and fights that he's gotten hurt for and had to sit out. Maybe he took an extra training camp. I don't know. But Khabib to me is an unstoppable monster. But that is why I'm going to go to round 5 and make a pick that I don't even know if I agree with. Okay. But it's round 5, and so everyone knows when round 5 and you're losing, which I am, you got to just start throwing haymakers. So my prediction is Khabib gets knocked out for the first time in his career by Diamond Dustin, former WEC champion.
That is extremely bold, but I see where you're coming. I completely see where you're coming, and I'll tell you why. We've seen Khabib get rocked. He went toe-to-toe with Conor, looked really good.
Rocked Conor.
Rocked Conor. His striking had improved for Conor, and you could tell he really, really trained that in his camp before that fight. However,
The most wicked left hands we've ever seen against Conor McGregor.
absolutely. I think the first time he's ever been... No, he's been knocked down before. Anyways, let's take it back to April 7, 2018. Ally Quinta, first round. Khabib gets rocked. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it is definitely a possibility, and I completely see why you think that way. I think it is absolutely a possibility that Khabib gets rocked, Khabib gets knocked out, and the impossible happens. Dustin Poirier finally gets that unifying title belt, and then gets to face, hopefully, Tony Ferguson for the 155-pound belt, which we would all love to see.
And as we've been talking about legends who have maybe exceeded their prime, they have double-digit losses under their belt. I think Diamond Poirier only has about five or six. He's a decorated fighter. Legend, yeah. Decorated fighter, came from the WEC into the UFC. Just a great talent. Humble guy, respectful guy, but he's a dog. He's a dog. He can strike. He's got a chin. He can wrestle. I think this training camp is going to be the most important one that he will ever have because he's prepping for an absolute bear in Khabib
Nurmagomedov.
I can say it. I know. My mouth is dry.
I just last thoughts about Dustin. That fight against Max Holloway, everybody counted him out. Even though Max Holloway was making the jump. Max Holloway is arguably the greatest featherweight champion of all time.
True.
With that being said, it is so interesting to think about the greatness of Dustin Poirier. The fact that he absolutely dismantled one of the pound-for-pound best fighters on the planet when nobody gave him a chance. And he absolutely won every single round of those fights against Max. It was almost hard to watch for me as a Max fan. And I think Poirier is a great fighter. I think that he absolutely has the ability and the chance to knock out Khabib Nurmagomedov, as bold as it may be.
All right, Nosebleed section, we've got one more point to give, and it is our honorable mention of the day. Should we just call this American Top Team Show?
We really should.
We really should.
Really should.
That's pretty much all we've talked about. And to not stray away from, what we're good at, which is talking about American Top Team, news that we didn't really get to, but we will definitely be touching on later as it develops. The newest story that came out today is that Tyron Woodley will be taking a hiatus, or he'll be leaving American Top Team to go up to Montreal and train with the legend. If we're talking about legends, GSP.
Yes, it is going to be an unbelievable camp that he will be joining. It is going to be so much fun. My jiu-jitsu coach is trained with GSP's coach as well as Rory McDonald up there in Montreal, Canada, and he says that it is something out of control. It is some of the most intense training he's ever had in his entire life, and he's brought those things back to our gym as well. I think that this is going to be so good for Tyron Woodley. I think this is going to tighten up all the things and tie up all the loose ends that he needs in order to get back to that belt, which I still believe he can completely contend for. It's just going to take a few fights, but I think him joining GSP is one of the best moves you can make with some of the greatest MMA minds of all time.
All right, that is it, Nosebleed section. We thank you again so much for tuning in for our inaugural episode of From the Nosebleeds podcast. Really quick, name a better duo, GSP and Tyron Woodley or Blake and Brick?
I would have to go with Blake and Brick.
That's a hot take. That
is a hot take.
All right, we thank you again so much. We want to encourage you to follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, especially on SoundCloud, and coming soon to Apple Podcast. We appreciate it. Blake, any last words before I choke you out?
All I got to say is thank you very much before I take you back. Appreciate it.
Awesome.
Thank you.